purchased this cylinder head for 1.6 liter Mazda Miata off of eBay, and it was damaged in the mail. So it's unusable to me, but I do want to take the valves off of it and send the valves out to Manley machine shop in New Jersey to have custom valves made for when I do install a cylinder head on my 1.6 liter. So I'm going to start by loosening up the bolts that hold the cam in place, and there's a specific order in which to loosen those bolts, and it shows right here for the camshaft bearing cap bolts. You loosen them a little bit at a time in sequence. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And to do that, you just need a 10mm socket. And then as I go, I'll loosen them a little bit at a time in the sequence, and then I'll probably have to make at least 4 rounds. And then I'm going to organize them by putting them through this box, and then that way I know exactly how they should be if I was to be reinstalling this head. So I'm making some progress removing the camshaft bearing cap bolts, the actual caps. Probably went around the loosening sequence about 4 times. First time I was only able to crack the bolts only just slightly, and then each subsequent turn I was able to get a little bit more on them until I was able to loosen them by hand. And then a couple things I want to point out. So if this was looking at the cylinder head from the front of the vehicle, the intake cam is on the left hand side and it's marked by I, and then the exhaust cam is marked by an E. And if it had the exhaust manifold hooked up, that would be a lot more obvious, but just want to point out that it is marked I and E. And then if you look at each subsequent cap going back towards where the rear of the vehicle would be, it's labeled E2, E3, E4, E5, and then it shows you with an arrow. These little caret arrows are pointing towards the front of the vehicle as well. So I try to be as organized as I can when I'm taking it apart so I know exactly how it goes back together, but those are some things to look out for as well. So once all the bolts were able to be loosened by hand, when it comes to taking the caps off, they'll be on there pretty tight, so you just have to firmly grasp them, give them a little wiggle back and forth, and then you'll be able to remove each one. The only place I ran into some issues was on the front of the cam caps where the RTV is. RTV was holding it in place a little bit, so I just used a plastic razor and was able to scrape the RTV off, and then you'll see on this one how it comes off with the camshaft. So I'm going to go ahead and finish removing the exhaust camshaft. Then I'm going to take a little bit of oil, and I just want to keep the cams lubed up some oil before I wrap them in plastic for safekeeping so they don't rust. And I'm going to put those camshafts inside of the box so everything's in one place. So with the camshafts removed, next I'll be taking out the hydraulic lifters. And these pop out rather easily. And then I have an egg crate labeled intake and exhaust side. And then I'm going to have to break another egg crate in half for an additional 2. But that's how I'll be keeping track of them. So here's the valve seat, and then the 2 keepers are inside. I'm to the point now where I'm removing the valves from the cylinder head. This is one of the intake valves that I've removed so far. So you have the valve itself, and that sits inside of a valve spring, the valve seat, and then the keeper, which goes to the top of the valve, and that keeps it all in one piece and under tension. So we'll see what that looks like inside of the cylinder head. So that's the valve guide that the valve comes up through, the cylinder head, and then that's the seat and the two keepers that are around the top of the valve, and everything's under tension. So I have this tool, which is part of a 2-pack by Lisle valve keeper remover and installer kit. So in this configuration, this is how you remove a valve. It's a hollowed out cylinder with a magnet, pretty strong magnet in the center of it. And what you do is you put this over a valve when it sits under tension, and put a rag underneath the cylinder head, put a few rags underneath it, something to absorb the impact, and then you either push down with a lot of strength, if you can get a lot of weight behind it, or you can use a mini sledge. Just be careful when you're using it, wear eye protection, watch your hands and don't mar up any of the surfaces. And you use an impact force or otherwise to push down on the valve spring, and as tension is being released when you're pushing down, the magnet will take the keepers up, remove the keepers, and then that will allow you to remove the entire assembly. So that's what the seat looks like there, and the keepers wind up inside of this tool. So there's the two keepers, and then at that point you can use the magnet of the tool, and that will remove the spring as well. So you see how the valve sits in there through the guide, and then I like to put a finger on the valve seal when I'm slowly pulling out the valve. So put a finger down there on it, and then pull out the valve from the other side, and you should hear a suction popping, and that's how you know you still have good suction and the valve is sealing pretty good. So I'm going to send 3 intake valves and 3 exhaust valves out to Manly to get custom valves made for this cylinder job. The exhaust valves were in a lot worse shape than the intake valves. If you can see, they're burned up pretty good. So I should be getting back the valves around a 6-week turnaround time they quoted me, and around $350 to get custom valves made. But they wanted some examples to go off of. If you do want to reinstall the valves, installations the opposite or reverse. So you install the valve from below the cylinder head, then make sure you put a bunch of rags underneath where the valve face would be. And that's gonna make sure that when you hit it with a hammer, that it does not sink further into the chamber. So you put the spring down, and then the seat goes on top, and then the 2 valve keepers go inside of the seat. Like so. And then there's an attachment that you put into the magnetic cylinder of the tool. And the tip of this is going to retract into the tool as you hit the top side with a hammer. And that's gonna allow the keepers to slide around the tip of the valve stem. So you're just gonna hit the top of the tool with a rubber mallet or a dead blow hammer, and it should be the exact opposite of removal.